Welcome to Redefining Engagement. I'm Francesca Dumar, Director of Audience Development and Strategy at Contribly. And in this show, I speak to leaders and innovators in the media industry so that we can bring tips, wisdom, ideas, and even some things to avoid so that we can all do more engagement better. So without further ado, let's move on to our next guest. Hi and welcome. I'm Francesca. Welcome to Redefining Engagement. Today we're talking to Jem, who hi Jem.
Hey, lovely to be here.
How about you introduce yourself? Tell me a little bit about you and your background, and then we'll get straight into it.
Yeah, I can try and sum it up. My name's Jem Collins. I am the director, editor, kind of all things, I guess, at Journo Resources. We're a social enterprise that supports journalists across the UK with free tools, resources, and community. So our audience itself is actually journalists. So perhaps a little bit meta for this conversation, but there we are. But we are still, I guess, a publisher in a traditional sense. We write articles, we share videos, we have a newsletter, and we have a lot of wraparound resources too. So have maybe some things to say, hopefully, from both sides of that, both being journalists and reporting to journalists. And yeah, I've been doing this for 8 years now. I have a background as a journalist. I've been a reporter for various national, regional, specialist newsrooms. And yeah, that's all I ended up here.
Really impressive background and super varied, from going from the newsroom into having your own newsroom in a way. What made the change? How did you do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually, and definitely a big change, but also I think one that isn't necessarily as big as you sometimes think. So I was let go of from one of my previous journalism jobs. Sadly, something that many of us in the UK will have experienced at some point in our journalism career. And that was what gave me the prompt into setting something up. I kind of often describe it as doing it the long way round, because I juggled it, did it alongside other things, and I think that gave me a, I guess, deeper understanding actually of our audience, because you really had to get under their skin and get to know them and get to know exactly what they want, rather than, I guess, chucking a load of resources at it to try and guess first. So that was, I guess, the push, was losing my job and working out what resources and tools I might need and that gap in the market. I also think it's weirdly not that different. When you've been a freelance journalist, you do end up having to do all of, I guess, the sides of business development that maybe you don't if you're in a reporting role. You definitely do if maybe you're a managing editor or if you're a bit more senior in a newsroom. I definitely think I drew on those skills as a freelance journalist as well.
That's super fascinating. And your audience is actually really interesting because they are you. Not every editor or every newsroom is actually talking to themselves when they're doing things, but this is a little bit different. What would you say, in your world, what does audience engagement mean to you?
Yeah, just to pick up, I guess, on what you just said there, and I think it's really interesting about our audience is us. So we do have a range of roles in our newsroom. So I'm looking after all of the business stuff. We have a deputy editor who's looking after the content. I have a co-director and people who look after design and tech and coding. But all of those people actually do have a background in journalism as well. So something that's been really important to us is having that lived experience within a newsroom. So maybe that's slightly jumping away from your question a little bit, but I think whatever newsroom you're in or whatever kind of, I guess, product you're trying to set up, I think that's been something that's really key to us, to have people who really understand that from a first-hand experience. And even our part-time staff who might be working in kind of admin or sales, again, they're still doing freelance journalism on the side, so they can actually understand as a user how these products might work. Our editorial resources coordinator does the admin, uploads those things, does that every week, does a great job, but is also the key user for those as well. So I think that's potentially quite interesting, and maybe quite unique in journalism. But I think, we have a lot of conversations about lived experience more broadly across the media, and I think you can get a lot from making sure you have those people in your newsrooms. But to get back to your original question, which I've side-skipped, we're only on question 2, and I've been side-skipping your questions already. So yeah, I think for us, audience engagement really focuses on depth and connection. So it's about how deeply people are engaging with our organisation, our publication. We obviously do all of the usual stuff that we will talk about. So, we're looking at views, even length of time on page. But for us, it's kind of how deeply can we get them to go, not just necessarily putting a comment in or subscribing to our newsletter, but have they contributed to some kind of resource, which is a collective that we then use and kind of create into something else that our users can use. So we have a lot of resources and pieces where it's our audience actually putting those things in to get something out. Or I guess on the financial side, are they prepared to put money down and kind of support? So for us, it's really on the depth side of things. We're really looking for engagement as how deeply do they feel connected to this brand, and how much are they going to do something that will kind of help push it forward, if that makes sense.
That's fascinating. So this depth that you're calling it depth, so it looks like people actually contributing time, not time, that's what you would usually measure, but in your case it's like how would they contribute to the resources? What does that look like?
I guess to give you a couple of examples, so our editorial resources coordinator I mentioned earlier collates a lot of these, and these are maybe slightly different from typical editorial products. But one example, for example, is our freelance pitch library, where people who are freelance journalists will get something commissioned, and then they will go onto our website and they will send us the pitch that they sent to an editor and the final published link. And that's a library that we publish that then other people can use. We do the same things for salaries, for freelance rates. And so again, these are kind of like wraparound products, I guess, from the actual editorial, but they're things that we know people will use on a day-to-day basis. They'll come back to that because people are always going to want to pitch. They're always going to want to know if they're getting paid correctly. They're things that we know our audience will use in their day-to-day lives. But it's about those people going, actually, yes, I've got that pitch commissioned. Now the next step is I'm going to send that to Journo Resources. That will get published on there. And we've got thousands of people who've submitted those data points, and that's where that resource comes from. So I guess it's kind of almost like a co-creation in a way, in that it's not possible for us to go, here's how this should look. That would just be an advice piece where it's just me telling my opinion. But actually, if we can bring our audience into that together, then we can create something much bigger that benefits everyone.
That's fascinating. How do you measure this depth? Are you measuring it? What does it look like?
So it's a real, I think, sliding scale. So obviously we're a very small team. So there are just 5 of us. But we do make sure that measuring this stuff is super important to us. So we have our directors meetings every month, and that's quite a flat structure, so everything gets fed to everyone. So I think that's again off on a tangent, but I think it's important that everyone's involved in these conversations, that they can see how this works. So through that we'll be tracking, I guess I kind of call it like a mixture of hard and soft metrics. So we'll be looking at how many people have submitted something to this, how many people have looked at this, but then how far down have they got through it, what is the click rate on the newsletter for them to actually go through to different areas. So we will have a big long list of all of those types of metrics all across the scale, and we'll be tracking those really hard things. But then we're also trying to kind of keep in touch with things which I guess they're a little bit harder to quantify and they're a little bit softer. So if we get people that reply back to our emails, for example, I'm sure many newsrooms do this, but it's a real email, so you can reply to it. You can say, hey, I really like this, or I didn't like that. That is something that we'll always kind of bring up and have a discussion about and make sure that gets replied to. So very long and wordy answer, but yes, everything that's numerical, we do make sure we kind of keep and we track, and that's kind of nailed down, and we go, how do we make that better? What do we change? But then on the flip side of that, we also try and capture some of that softer stuff as well. So if someone just tells us they like something, I think that's equally as important and genuine. This is going to sound very simple and very basic, but having just a channel on the Slack where you pop in the nice comments or the bad comments, just so that that's also captured as well. Because I think sometimes you can not get bogged down in too much of the hard data, but you need to see the context around that as well.
It's got to be pretty good for someone to take their time to actually email back and say, by the way, that was really useful, that was really helpful, because
we take for granted sometimes those interactions. They don't happen often enough, or even when they happen a lot, it's important for everybody in the team to know. I totally agree. And that's interesting. I love your definition of engagement, and this depth that you're looking at. And so many more newsrooms should be doing that, in my opinion, in their own version of that. But I love it. How would you say your definition of engagement has changed or evolved? Because your past experience is so different to this experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's maybe just shifted more along the same linear scale, perhaps. So I think we've always been quite passionate that we've really wanted to own our audience and own the space that they're in. So the newsletter has always been a core focus for us because that's something that we own and that's our own kind of space. Those co-created resources, again, are something that we own. They're on our own website. We're not relying on another, platform for that. But I guess we've just, over the past couple of years, tried to move even further to the kind of doing side of things. So we're more and more interested in those deeper interactions and trying to see how far you can kind of push people towards the sorry, I'm gonna have to turn Slack off in my ears.
Go
Give
for
me
it.
a sec. Right. I also changed it to a really jaunty tune, which is really unhelpful right now.
Oh, I know the feeling. I actually, while you were talking, was
gone.
really quickly closing WhatsApp as well on my laptop because I could hear it pinging in my ear. I was like, shush.
Yeah, it's like great. I've got loads of colleagues now, but they're all chatting about stuff. So right, they're gone.
So you were saying you've gone from this owning the space to doing that.
Yeah. So I think, I think the thing for us over the last couple of years has been, we've always been really passionate about owning the space. So whether that's our core product, our business is essentially built out of the newsletter, really. That was where we first started and grew from. And that's the space that we own. And so I think that's allowed us to weather quite a lot of changing storms of algorithms or SEO or however you want to put it. But I think what we've tried to do is move to a more kind of active side of that scale. So, whereas once we might have been like, wow, it's really great that a lot of people have commented on this. Now we're kind of going, have they shared this to anyone? Or for us, really, as I mentioned, it's about them doing something that relates specifically to our mission to forwarding the brand forward, I guess. This is maybe a little tangential. I know I've done this quite a lot now, but I think with more generally in the industry, we've kind of seen more of a growing acknowledgement that like stack it high, sell it low, just doesn't really lead you to any real, I guess, audience loyalty. Sure, you can get a ton of eyeballs and they see it through Google News or whatever, but do they care who you are? And we know that newsrooms get their money from a ton of different buckets. But if you look at the Reuters Trends report for this year, like subscriptions is being viewed as increasingly important. And that's a big thing for us, which we've been trying to do strategy on. And so for us, that's really about, I guess, the depth and the loyalty side of that is making people feel like they're really invested and making them feel like they're part of that co-creation. And so for us, those measures have really become about actively doing something that actually, you mentioned earlier about, it takes a lot maybe for someone to email you. So I guess the informal way of, I guess, how it's changed is our measure is this easier to do than picking up my phone, swiping and just pressing something? So we're interested in those things where someone's taken an active decision to go and do something.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I think I'm gonna use that more, like going from this space where we own it to going to a space where there's the action around it and it's thought out. I think that's fantastic. And what in this world that you're talking about, in the world that you're working in your experience, what aims does this audience engagement strategy deliver on? So you mentioned subscriptions. Is that the main place that you're trying to get to, or is there something else behind that?
Yeah, I think it would be lying if I said subscriptions or memberships weren't a big part of that. Like, it's really important for us to be sustainable, especially as a small independent publisher. You have some quite tight margins a lot of the time, so that really is a big thing for us. And I do think that whilst memberships and financial I guess implications weren't necessarily they weren't the primary thought when we were first setting up and delivering those ethoses. When we first set up, we went, here's our brand values, here's our mission, this is what we stand for. But I think holding yourself accountable to that and holding yourself accountable to your readers is something that's super important in people feeling that they then actually believe you and are then willing to give you money. So I do think that is a huge part of that. So I think for many newsrooms, money is always going to be the big question. We ultimately have to make this pay for itself, and I think audience engagement is a really important part of that, because people, in my opinion, are only really going to give you money if they actually really connect with you as a brand and they find you really useful and they trust you. And to me, all of those things fit into that audience engagement bucket. So for us, doing that, being accountable, co-creating, all of those kind of things is one of the most important reasons I think that people do give to us. I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but in our audience engagement survey last year, there were more people that said they were giving to us and picking to take out a membership because they believed in the brand and what it was doing than there were people who went, this is really useful. Now that's a separate conversation in itself, because there's other people to be captured and other things to do, but I think it's something that we're really quite proud of, that people are happy enough to give us money because they believe in that ethos and they think they're able to hold us accountable to it. So yeah, I think money is a big thing, and I think whilst we are quite a niche small publisher, I think that does hold true more broadly, in that I think about who I spend money with in news outlets. I spend money for outlets that I connect with and I believe in their mission. So I think audience engagement is kind of, a big part of that.
Congratulations, first of all, and so many people be like really your brand resonating with them, because that's huge. And I think a lot of publishers are struggling with that. And especially congratulations on that, because you're a small team. And it does make it a little bit harder, and it has its benefits and it has its challenges. And I think a lot of potentially even hyperlocal brands will relate when it comes to engagement, because you want to engage with your audience, especially if you're a small team. Is that one of the main challenges in your opinion? Is it the fact that you're a small team, or is there something else that's stopping brands from engaging better like your own? Like what are the hurdles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's an interesting one in that, and this isn't necessarily an answer, so to speak, but I think everyone's having that everyone has hurdles, has challenges with audience engagement. So, I think it'd be very easy for me to say, yeah, I'm a small team and this is really hard, but I'm sure, you've spoken to dozens of people who are much bigger organizations, and I'm sure they would equally be telling you that it's really hard. So that's not to say that it isn't hard for smaller publishers, but I think it is a universal experience that maybe no one's quite cracked yet. I guess in terms of hurdles and challenges, I think obviously, we've talked a little bit about how, when we get feedback that's good, that's great. But I think it's also worth mentioning that kind of goes two ways. So if we have an advert or a piece of content that people don't like because they are very invested in the brand, they'll tell us about that. And then we have to have a conversation about what we do about that. And I think the wider point that maybe that kind of links into, which does relate to capacity, is that if you are doing audience engagement, you do need to do it, and you're trying to offer this kind of experience of co-creation, of a real feeling that you are a valued, I guess, part of that conversation. You do need to be able to close the loop, and I think that is really difficult. So if you're offering people the opportunity to feed in, you actually need to be able to say, well, here's what we did with that, or why we didn't do that. And I think that's potentially something that can get missed sometimes. It's just making sure that you're able to close that loop, because there's nothing worse than someone feeling like, hey, I've given you all of this stuff, I've done this, and A, it's either been ignored, or B, actually you haven't actioned this or thought it through. So I think that is potentially something I'd flag for teams of all sizes, really, is just thinking about how you close that loop and make sure that people feel that has actually gone somewhere, I guess.
I haven't actually had that as a response before, that closing of the loop piece. And it is really interesting because you are audience first when you're thinking of that. Could you give me an example of how you found out that you need to close the loop, or how did you get to that conclusion? What?
So I guess one of the examples that maybe you can say that will speak to this is, so we do a big audience survey every year, where there's a whole ton of stuff in this, which is both demographics, both what would you want to change, what would convince you to be a member, all kinds of stuff. So the pretty standard stuff that most places are doing. But we kind of realized when we were doing the ask for it that if we were just kind of saying to people, hey, we want to take this and we're going to kind of, I guess, use this to make some cash, that's not really kind of authentic to our values, and people won't really engage with that. And we've definitely seen a much like bigger uptake once we've really gone away and thought about the kind of, I guess, the sell for that. So each year now, we'll go, this is this year's big audience engagement survey. Here's what we did off the back of the last one. So that's, I guess, a very small example, I guess, but I could see how when we were first doing that, I don't think it was meant as inauthentic, but when you're asking people for a lot of that kind of stuff, people are quite rightly wary. We're in a kind of, data grabby age where, every website wants to take all of your data, use that in some kind of way, and people were going, well, how does this fit? And so we had to kind of do a bit of thinking about how we go, well, okay, how do we ask you to do this in a way that fits those values, but then B, I think the flip side of that was going, well, we do this every year, so as part of that ask, we're going to tell you what we changed off the back of last time. So that's perhaps the biggest example of how that's changed the way that we present something, I think, rather than just kind of chucking something out there and expecting people to do it just because they like you. You have to kind of tell them your ethos and why you're going to do it.
I bring that up a lot when I work with different brands, about that it is about that value exchange, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it's true that if somebody, if someone sends you content and nothing happens, well, they're very unlikely to do it again. If someone, but it's so easy to skip that piece, that next step, especially if you haven't got the processes to do it and the rest of it. But I love, there's a whole piece around how you word that, and you're clearly hitting the nail on the head there, especially in that example. So I really enjoyed that. And what strategies would you say have proven most effective when you're engaging your audiences? Do you have any experiences that you could share with me on that one?
Yeah, so I did think about this actually, because you very kindly set some talking points beforehand, and I'm fully aware that what I may be about to say may be in a little bit of contradiction to what we were talking about earlier about, I guess, owned spaces. But I think, as well as that stuff we were just chatting about around it being genuine, it being co-creation and kind of closing that loop, I think also you just have to really think about how you remove barriers. So I think that's that's been a real focus for us, especially over the last 12 months. So just making it easier for people to interact with you in a deeper way. And so one of the examples of this, which again might sound a little bit contradictory, is that all of our video watchbacks are really simply hosted on YouTube as private videos. I think when you're charging for a product, so that's something that's part of our membership, we offer live and recorded events. I think it can be really easy to get caught up in a bit of a funk of like, oh, we need to build something bespoke because people are paying for it, and we're very lucky. We do have a bit of in-house like dev capacity, but you kind of have to ask yourself, like, are we really going to be able to build a better system than YouTube? We could just send it to them and then they can watch it on their phone, they can watch it on their TV, they can watch it on their laptop, they can AirPlay it, they can pick it up again on a different device, whatever they want. And we know that works for people. We know that when we then look at the recordings and the statistics we have behind them, we can see that a lot of them are watched to the end and they've got hundreds of hours of continual kind of minutes watched, hours watched. So Yeah, I think for us, it's been about trying to remove barriers. And that might sound a little bit contradictory because I'm talking about owning stuff. But I think also, especially as a small publisher, just kind of accepting when, if there is another solution out there, I don't think you should be don't write it off for the sake of, I guess, pride, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Oh, I completely agree. Because at the same time, it's also about reach. Like we aren't tech companies. We have a different product. So there's nothing stopping you from engaging on social media, but then giving a better reason for people to come back for something else. We can be more than one thing for everybody, can't we? In a
Yeah.
sense.
And I guess another example is we've recently moved our kind of membership provider. So we've moved to Memberful, that now kind of sorts out all of our memberships. And previously in our old system, to get into our Discord forum, which again, not necessarily an own space, but works well for us, that's a space where we want people to join to talk to each other. Since we've switched to Memberful, which allows you to just click a button rather than have to go to a link and enter some information, in the first month of this year, we've already seen like half the amount of people that we had doing that than we did in the time frame of the whole of last year with one of our student accounts. So there's a real kind of growth of taking away that barrier, making it that you can just click a button, means that we've had more people. We're going to have more people, I think, by fivefold than we did last year, just by making it easy, and nothing else has changed. So that's something we've been thinking a lot about, is how do you take those barriers away. And sometimes it's great to create something bespoke and in-house, and we've tried to do that a lot. So on the flip side, our jobs board, that is a bespoke build, and that was because there were specific things that we wanted it to do that we hadn't seen elsewhere. And particularly, we have a button you can press that says "No jobs in London, please," because that's something that our audience really wanted. But I think, just having that, I guess, rational thought process of how do we take those barriers away? Is it better that we do that or someone else do that? And making that really easy for your audience.
So when you're considering your audience, you're considering barriers. At what point in the process are you making these decisions? How are you considering your audience? How does that take shape in your newsroom?
So I do believe that I think audience engagement it shouldn't be about retrofitting. So I do believe audience engagement needs to kind of come in from the start, and that needs to be as part of your discussions as early as possible in that process, depending on what it is that you're creating. So for our bigger kind of builds and bigger kind of strategic decisions, that will form a key part of us even deciding whether we want to do them and what we want to look like. So we've got our kind of big strategy day, which will be in December, and part of that will be looking at various bits of data as to either what people have told us or what we can see that they've used or not used. So kind of comparing those two things together. But especially for our big launches, that kind of audience engagement piece is from the very start, because we want to make sure that, especially with a small team, when you don't have an endless amount of resources, you want to make sure if you're taking a punt on something new that you've got some data to back that up. So I think understanding who your audience is and what they want, I think that should kind of guide your editorial strategy almost. And that's not to say that you should never take a punt on anything, but I think it can give you a feel of there have absolutely been times when we've gone, let's try this and see what it's working. There have been times that things have surprised us, but I think having that in the back of your mind and having those, as I mentioned, we make sure everyone gets to know those stats every month, no matter where they are in the newsroom. So everyone gets to know them. That's kind of part of strategy day. And that can kind of, I think, give you a context and give you a sense when you are making those decisions from the very start.
I want to go and pick back on that comment that you made in there where you said, we've had things that surprised us. Could you share maybe a successful or potentially not so successful initiative or something that's boosted your audience engagement and maybe a little bit of a reflection on why you think it might or might not have been so successful?
Yeah, well, I can do one of each if you like. It only seems fair. And I always feel like I can't go on and just tell everyone that everything's wonderful, because I think experimentation is still, super important. So I think something that worked well. So we set up, I guess, like much of the world, during the pandemic, we set up our online event series, and that was kind of born out of a need for people saying that they wanted more community, they wanted to kind of be part of something. So that wasn't necessarily a surprise, but I guess what has surprised me is the longevity of that. We kind of picked that up as not a stopgap, so to say, but previously to the pandemic, we were kind of going, well, every 6 months we'll need to go and visit a different place in the UK, and we'll kind of do that in-person connection. And I kind of would have maybe naively assumed that maybe that's what we would have gone back to doing. But people kept wanting to come to them, people kept enjoying them. And I think that was a surprise for me, because I've always been the kind of person that likes to go out, that likes to speak to people. And we're still doing them now. So we still do between 2 and 3 live events a month, and we still get people coming to them. So I think that was a surprise. And I think the reflection that I would take from that is, I guess, thinking in a slightly more granular detail about how your audience uses some of these things, and what the use case is. And actually, I think it was more the splitting out of I would like to meet some people and connect with them, to I would like something really useful and I'm going to watch this back. And actually they are 2 very different strands that maybe we were combining before. So I guess really niching down and into that. But yeah, I found that quite surprising, as I thought that was going to be a pandemic trend that kind of faded away, but absolutely wasn't. And yeah, I think the reflection would be to kind of really dig a little bit deeper into the why something is working. If you know something is working, that's great. But I don't think we'd properly interrogated that there were multiple strands to why people were coming to these events, so that we could have split that out further, if that makes sense.
It is fascinating how on the COVID bit, I think it forced so many publishers to work differently, didn't it? And it's almost like there's so many things that we all ended up doing that we never thought would last. Maybe we need some more crazy changes in our life that make us test something new and see how it goes that we never would have had before.
But 100%, I think I appreciate, we've spoken a little bit about how data and all of that kind of stuff is super important, and that leads your decisions. But sometimes, a big event like that, I think, really can force you to do something outside of the box. I really like there's a particular, I think, innovation strategy or theory, I can't remember what it's called, but it's this idea of how would you do this if this was taken away, and just taking away various different parts of what you currently do. And I think that's a really good way of forcing you to, I guess, think about how you might do kind of things a little bit differently. But yeah, I owe you one that didn't work. What would I say about that? So this was quite a while ago, and I'm sure this is something that people have spoken to you about a lot, about the difference between what people say they want and what they actually want. I'm sure this has come up many times, but we tried to, for a short amount of time, introduce a second newsletter. Newsletter's always been our strongest product, and we're very happy with the amount of people, the amount of we've got an open rate of 60%. We're very happy with this. We were like, makes sense, right? We know that people love this. We want to do a second one. And people were really telling us that they wanted, again, that community feel. They wanted to have a space to, I guess, share their successes and share their work. So we tried to set up a second newsletter, which was more about sharing, I guess, community wins. And no one cared. And no one cares because people are slightly selfish. They want to share their own stuff. They don't necessarily care so much about other people's. And I think maybe they don't care so much about other people's in a medium which is slightly less about interaction. What's been really interesting, actually, is since we've put a bit of a push on our Discord forum, is that we do actually have people in there who will share their work and interact with it, because that's more personal. But people were telling us they wanted this. We tried it in an email format because we had a very successful track record with that, but then it just fell flat and people didn't really engage with it or care, because all they wanted was to put their stuff out. And I think part of that was, again, because it was someone from our team curating it, but it wasn't an interaction with another person. So yeah, I'm sure you've had this this a lot about that gap between what people say they want and what they don't want. But I guess the reflection on that would be A, around that, but B, I think around thinking about the format. And I think if we'd thought about it with the hindsight now of seeing how people chat to each other in our Discord and share their own highlights, I guess reader spotlights and all of that kind of stuff, they're doing that organically. And it's kind of like people talking. They didn't actually need us to do that. We just needed to facilitate a space. But yeah, that was, I wouldn't say it was a waste of time, but that took up a lot of resources that maybe we didn't need to we didn't need to do.
Wow, what an example. It kind of makes sense, but it's always easy to say it makes sense when you look back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But no, do you know what? I don't get enough examples like that where you go, oh, you know, people say they want one thing and actually they don't want that. I haven't had enough of those, so I loved that.
Yeah,
I say I want a lot of things and then they don't necessarily happen in my personal life, but maybe not necessarily in this situation.
but like, yeah, you have to balance that, right? If you're also consistently going out to people and asking their opinion, like you're always going to have something where you try and it doesn't land, right? So I think you have to kind of expect that occasionally that's going to happen. And that's also, I think, why we always did try and do this, but try and balance what people are saying in those softer data kind of surveys of what would you like more of, with, okay, here's some data about what you actually read and what you actually click through on. Yeah.
So fascinating. And going back a little bit, we've mentioned tech a tiny bit. We mentioned, going towards tech that already exists because they do a really good job. What role do you see technology like, I don't know, AI, data analytics playing in these audience engagement efforts that you're doing?
That's a good question. It's been something I'm trying to challenge myself to think about a little bit more lately. I think for me, the tech and the AI in particular, I think really ties to the hard data side of things. I think I mentioned earlier, we kind of have the hard data and the soft data, of things that people might just tell us, and that's quite qualitative. I think for me, I view those tech and AI tools as a means to better crunch the numbers, and better kind of make it easier for us to provide those insights to the whole of the newsroom to go, here are our 4 data points that we're tracking, here's how we've performed on them, here's how that's tracked over time. And we definitely do that. I think where I don't see it currently is as a kind of authentic way of engaging with people. We did put a couple of questions in our last audience survey about kind of, I guess, AI tools that people might find useful, and broadly people were like, this isn't what we come to you for. We come to you for this newsletter because we know a human has written it, and unlike, say, for example, our jobs roundup, most of the others on the market are automated and they're picked based on what's popular, whereas we have a human who will put them in, write something perhaps a little bit witty and go, we've personalized these. So I think for us, it's about taking those tech and AI tools to help us better understand the data and see those kind of, I guess, bigger picture things that would maybe take us a lot of time to analyze. One thing we do, and this is maybe jumping on to a different area, but one of the big things we do every year is we do an insights report onto the journalism jobs market. Like a lot of other publishers, we have a jobs board, and so we try and leverage that data in a way that's really useful for our audience. So we'll be looking at which jobs were the most looked at, like what kind of types of jobs were they, so that we can create something that's really useful for our audience. So we can say to them, if you're looking for opportunities, this is an oversubscribed area, this is an overlooked area. And for me, that's something that I'm quite looking forward to this year, because I think that AI and tech tools we now have will make that a lot easier, that it's not someone from our team slogging away and going, gosh, I'm adding all of these things up, or I'm putting them into a spreadsheet or downloading it and, doing their best with a formula. So I think it's really useful in those instances in combing through data sets, but in terms of actually how we interact with people, I think the way that we've kind of set ourselves up is it's all and has always been very curated and very human. So we wouldn't necessarily want to be putting that in the actual chatbot space, or, that's kind of doing the reply for you. For us, we see it more as a how to help us understand the things that we're getting.
I keep hearing this audience survey from you,
Sorry, I
and
keep
I'm
going
fascinated.
through the same thing.
I want to know more on this. So, because I one of my questions was going to be like, how do you integrate feedback and that data into this? But maybe let's go to this audience survey for a second. You said you do one a year. What kind of questions? Because not enough publishers are doing that. That is for sure. There's no question about that. Tell us about it. What are you asking? How do you use it? How do you feedback?
Yeah, so as I say, we do one a year, and I think that helps it. I think that's quite important, is that we're then able to make it it's quite a big thing. We can make a song and dance about it. We send an email every week that people get and they open. And then once a year, we send an additional email, and we're like, this is the one time a year, literally the only one time a year that you're going to get another email for us with an ask. So I think that helps because we can make it into a kind of bigger thing. But we kind of ask a bit of a mixture of stuff. So there are kind of almost, I guess, maybe like three parts to it. So the first part is mainly around demographics. So that's really important to us. Part of our mission is we're free and open to everyone, but we're specifically there to support marginalised and underrepresented communities within journalism. So we want to kind of hold ourselves accountable to that and see where we should be doing better. So we will be asking all sorts of stuff around how people identify, where they're based, kind of what ages. But there's also interesting things I think within that about how people perceive themselves. So something I found really interesting this year was we asked whether people would consider themselves to be early, mid, or senior level in their careers, and then tracked that against age. And we were basically able to say that people don't have the confidence to say that they're mid-level in their career, whereas actually they're saying that obviously age is not a perfect metric, but it's like these two numbers don't add up here. So we'll ask a lot of those demographic kind of questions. We'll then ask a little bit about how they find us and how they use us. So, what parts of the website did they use? What did they not use? What is the most useful? And what could we kind of do in the future? And then we will also have at the end just like all of our wild ideas that we've come up with, and we're like, which of these might you like? And they can tell us which they'd like, which they don't like. They can also submit their own wild ideas. And then finally, part 3 is we also have some questions about membership. So, what would get them over the line? What did they not know about? Like, what are the key kind of, I guess, barriers there? So, yeah, 3 parts: demographics, how they use the site and what they would like to see more of, and then just a little bit about like, you say you're really engaged, you're using this quite often. Did you know about this membership? How would we get you further down the line? So it's actually quite a hefty survey, to be honest. And we thought quite a lot. We worked with a consultant to kind of get it right and get the ordering right as well, to make sure we were putting things first. We had a lot of thoughts when we first did it about, things about demographics are quite personal questions. So do you want to be opening with that? Is that going in too hard? And that's why we also had to think quite a lot about, what is the purpose of this? And because we're able to explain to people that this is part of our values and checking that we're getting stuff right, and that if we're claiming we're more representative than the industry than we actually are, then, that's a problem. But yeah, we've had to think quite carefully about the order in which we do things, and really, I guess how we sell that and how we tell people that we're going to use it, to make sure that we actually get like a good reaction of that. So yeah,
That's huge. It sounds like a really big job, but it sounds so useful. How you mentioned you feedback to your audience on this survey. What does that look like?
So generally we tend to kind of, as we are a super small team, there are some changes that we might make that might take a while, and typically what we will tend to do is, at the very least, when we're putting the next one out, it will also have a thing that says, as off the back of last year, here are a couple of things. Here are a couple of things that we did. So I'm trying to think of a specific example, but we made some small tweaks to the jobs board, for example, because we noticed a lot of people were asking to be able to search in a slightly different way, and they wanted a different tagging system. And that was actually very easy for us to do. We noticed a ton of people were asking for that. We were like, actually, that's a great idea. Let's do that. So that was in our kind of list of here's what we did. And then more generally throughout the year, whenever we do something that is kind of either directly or tangentially related to that, we make sure that our comms around that is saying, you asked us to do this, so we've delivered. So the main centerpiece is when the next one comes out, because you can come up with that nice list of here are the maybe 5 things that we've done, and it doesn't have to be huge. You're just kind of saying to people, here are all of the things that we've done. And some of it's been actually super simple. Like, some people have been like, I don't know, I find this thing a little bit hard to read, so we've made a small tweak to the key system so that it's easier for them to read. So some things have been really tiny, but then other things are bigger and feed into what is the next thing we're going to put dev time on. And yeah, we feed back when we're putting the new one out, and then just generally in our comms, every time we launch something, if it is related, we want to make sure we tell people about that so that they feel that they've had that ownership in that. So yeah, across next year's survey and any, I guess, kind of comms about new stuff launching.
That's great. You're doing such a good job on the market. It sounds like the dirty word, really, marketing, but it is a bit of marketing in there as well, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think it all ties together. And I think if you are, thinking about it in a kind of like, I think we talked earlier about the engagement, that engagement is really quite linked into being sustainable and making money. That doesn't mean that you're not living by your values and you're not doing them for a good reason, but all of these things tie together. Like you need all of these stats in order to be sustainable, and in order to push forward. So yeah.
And what about in the future? Like where do you see the future of audience engagement going? I was going to say maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, but maybe stick to like 3 for now.
I was going to say 10 years out, who knows?
But where do you see it going? You can see where you are now. What's next?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for us, at least in the short term, so at least over the the next 12 months, we're definitely continuing on that kind of like, how do you push people to go deeper? How do you take away those barriers? So I think that will continue to be the key focus for us. I think the thing that we have I found particularly interesting, that I would love to play around with more, is kind of journalism, kind of, I guess, dipping its toe into the software as a service space. Maybe that sounds like a bit of a curveball, but we've been thinking a lot about, again, how you get people to interact with you on a daily basis. So one of the things we have built, everyone's built one, but we've got our own transcription service, which has been focused for journalists in the terms that it's very privacy centric and you kind of get unlimited minutes, etc. So that's been a really interesting, I guess, thinking for us. And I think that's also been slightly echoed by, if you look at like, Wordle, LinkedIn games, all of those, they're less software as a service, but they're really trying to think about what's the thing that our audience will come back to use every day. So I think I will be interested to see in that space, maybe over the next 3 to 5 years, if newsrooms can start to hit on slightly more of the products, I guess, that people will want to use. I think we've started doing that with some of those games. I think we've also seen a lot of publishers really invest in their kind of recipe space as well, where they've got really immersive, like, here's the list, you can cook along. But I'd be interested to see how that develops, I think, over the next 3 to 5 years, because that's what we're thinking about from our end of what. And again, this is not to replicate what's already out there. I think sometimes you see a bit of chat about this as to going, our newsroom software developers, you can't do anything better. Chorus shut down, which was the independent CMS system that I think Vox used to run. So I'm not necessarily saying that we're trying to replicate anything, but I think it would be interesting to see if, as publishers, we really understand our audience. So we might be able to create new products that they may genuinely want to use every day. And that's what we're thinking about, at least. And I think newsrooms are having those thoughts where they're thinking about recipes and games. So I'll be really interested to see, I guess, how that develops and what kind of additional wraparound products and kind of experiences they might provide that people will engage with on a daily basis.
I actually agree with you on that one. I think because there's not necessarily as much money in a newsroom, let's be honest, a lot of the tools that newsrooms end up using are tools that were originally made for, marketing teams, or it's very much made for that world. And we are going into a world where it's cheaper to create these products, but they also need to hit the nail on the head for those users, i.e. the journalists who need them. So yes, you could use, a transcription service that already exists, but I can totally understand how you would want one that's specific for journalists. In the same way, people use things like, maybe I shouldn't mention names, but, marketing tools. And that's where we sit as well. You want to be made with journalists. And also a lot of people decide where they put their money based on what the ethos is behind it. So, for example, if they knew that their money for the transcription service was going to your brand, and they know what your ethos is, then they're probably more likely to want to pay for that than pay for another tool that already exists, where the money's going elsewhere. So, yeah, it is an interesting world that we're moving into.
And I absolutely agree with you agreeing with me. But I absolutely agree with what you said there about, like, I really do think there's a space for, there may be tools in that space that exist. And as you say, that's, there are perhaps other platforms that claim they could do what you do, but you've really kind of honed in and gone, we're experts at this because we really understand the audience, we really understand what you need. We're not selling you a marketing tool. Actually really I think there are very few tools that actually center the experience of the journalist. So I absolutely agree with that, and that's definitely something that we're thinking about. We've got a couple of products that we're looking to kind of build next, and they're similarly, like, I'm sure you could bodge this together from other things, and lots of people do and probably have a great time, but actually really going, what are the needs of these journalists, or what are the needs of those users that maybe are being overlooked?
And last, maybe two more questions for me.
Okay.
One is on impact. So what impact has increasing your audience engagement had on the organization's bottom line? Have you measured that as well?
So we've one of the things we have been tracking this year, and this is still a work in progress, but one of the things we have been tracking this year is I think I mentioned earlier that I'm sure a lot of newsrooms can relate in that there are lots of different segments of the pie where you are trying to bring in various different buckets of money. And so a big focus that we've been having this year is growing the member revenue kind of portion. I wouldn't say that we are there yet, but we did do a sprint in July to kind of test out some of those initial principles of we think we've done a good job on audience engagement. How do we necessarily push this to the next step, and talk about this in our kind of funnel to push people through that? And that was pretty successful. And we noticed a really significant kind of uplift in people who are willing to kind of take that out. So we're definitely not there yet. And it's a very kind of small percentage, so to speak, at the moment, because it was a bit of a sprint test. But we've definitely seen so far, when we're tracking that stuff, it's definitely made a difference. And I think for July, if you're looking for a number, I think we managed to double our trial rate. So by putting those things into progress, obviously it's a much smaller number than I'm sure big newsrooms would be dealing with, so it's easier to double your trial rate. But for us, definitely putting those things into practice has definitely seen a tangible result for our bottom line. Absolutely.
Don't put yourself down. Doubling is doubling. Okay, yes, from 0 to 1, but honestly, doubling is doubling, and that is a success in itself.
I'll take that.
And last question for you. Have you got a little engagement hack for me by any chance? Maybe something that, if someone was starting out on their engagement journey, what would you suggest they do?
So maybe this is less a hack. But I think something that maybe we sometimes forget to do is a big thing that we just spent a lot of time doing this year, is just actually going and just chatting to people. I think sometimes we can get all bogged down in numbers, and we can talk about how we do stuff and how we're not going to do stuff and what that means. But actually, we spent a lot of time over the summer. I think I booked about 12 interviews just with some of our members, just with some of our readers, and we had a chat for half an hour. That doesn't give you any tangible data, so to speak, but it was absolutely fascinating, and the insights and the kind of next level of detail that you can get. And that is something that's absolutely free to do. You can just say to someone, hey, you use this site, would you be up for a chat? Maybe you buy them a coffee, and anyone can do that, publish from any level. And I just think actually having that, I think, conversation can spark a load of stuff that you definitely wouldn't have got from something that someone's typed in, or that they have, the data sets that you have. So yeah, that would be my one thing to maybe go, if you're just starting out, have a chat with someone who's reading you, or someone who you think is your target audience, because I think it can spark all kinds of things that maybe you wouldn't have thought of. And I found it genuinely fascinating when we did it this year. So
big love on that one. Huge love on that one. Thank you so much, Jem. This was such a fantastic conversation, and I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
well, thank you. Yeah, it's been good to chat about it.